today we'll be Angie and I, we'll keep deepening here into this topic around trauma, meditation, mindfulness. And today, I'm excited. We're going to talk a little bit about why it is that we can end up in difficult circumstances in meditation practice. Um, in my experience, if you understand why meditation can create problems, then you will be more empowered in your own practice. Especially, I know there's a few of you that offer mindfulness practices to others, or you might be working in healthcare as a coach or therapist. So, just simply knowing the main reason people get into trouble can be useful. And then we'll talk about different remedies. Angie was saying yesterday about, maybe it was this morning, about medicine. And, we have this whole range of different medicine or tools in practice. And so today we'll work with two main things. One is around safety and cultivating safety for ourselves inside of practice. And then, second, we'll do a little bit of work around self compassion and regulation. So, self compassion in the context of the window of tolerance that we talked about yesterday. So, as it was the last couple of days, it will be a combination of some lecture from me, but also a lot of practice, and then time for question and answer and comments. I've really appreciated your participation. So, why don't we begin here with a very short practice just to support all of our presence and arriving. So, finding a posture that suits you this morning. And if you'd like, you can take a couple of deeper breaths here with your eyes open or closed. And just taking this moment to check in with yourself. So much of practice are these little pauses where we notice what's happening, strengthening that muscle of mindful awareness. So you might notice your current state of your emotional state, or sensations in the body, or different thoughts that are here. All without trying to change your experience in this moment. Not pushing it away or pulling it closer. Just a clean observation and a knowing of the present moment. There's some allowing of whatever is happening to be here. Sometimes that's easier if we're feeling pleasant sensations or positive mood, or it can be more difficult if we're facing challenges. But that's the practice over and over again, simply being present with what is. A deep bow to ourselves and what's happening. And finally, If you'd like to direct any care and compassion towards yourself or someone else, just taking a moment to do that as well. Purposefully practicing form of loving kindness, of compassion for our own experience, and also extending that to others as well. And then in the next few breaths, you can begin to shift from this practice, whatever way works for you, some deeper breaths, some movement. And then we'll come into conversation here with each other. And thanks, everyone. Angie, when you have a moment, would you mind the screen sharing? Just okay. There we go. Great. Okay, so let me show some slides here. And again, I'll be sending these to Angie, so you'll have these shortly. But today we'll talk a little bit about why people find themselves in difficulty in meditation. And the easiest way I found to describe this is through a myth, and that's the myth of Medusa. So many of you will know this myth, but we have Medusa who has this superpower of that when people look into her eyes, they freeze or they turn to stone. She has these amazing snakes in her hair, and in the myth, we have Perseus who goes to Athena, the goddess of knowledge, and Athena says, in order to defeat Medusa, we need to have a shield. If you're going to be in this cave with Medusa, you would need to have some protection from her gaze, because if you look directly at her, you'll become frozen. And let me back up. There's a trauma writer named Peter Levine. Some of you will know him. He works with something called somatic experiencing. And he said that Medusa is a very helpful way to understand trauma. Because he said it's very similar when we have experienced trauma, that if we focus too much on traumatic sensations or dysregulating thoughts or memories, if we pay too close attention to these thoughts or this stimuli, we can freeze, we can become overwhelmed. So he said, it's when you live through trauma, it's kind of like Medusa is living inside of you. And in order to work with the trauma that we've experienced, we need a shield, we need protection inside of our lives and inside of our practice. So, in the first session 2 days ago, I mentioned that in my trauma work, the therapist said, "Tell me about what's working," and instead of saying, "Tell me all about your trauma." So, in a lot of trauma work, you don't focus too much too quickly on trauma because it can become overwhelming for people. So, why is this relevant then for us? Well, as you will have experienced, especially if you're new to meditation, a big part of meditation is paying attention to our internal world. We are asking people, or you're being asked, to notice what's happening in the mind and body. For some people, it might be feeling the breath more deeply or different sensations. So when we're in meditation, we are paying more attention to our inner world, which is great. There's a lot of research that says increased body awareness, for example, really helps with stress. So there's many good empirical reasons to pay attention inside. However, the problem is that if we've experienced trauma, there's a good chance that we will eventually um, be face to face with Medusa or face to face with our trauma. I mean, some of you here have been very kind of sharing your own experience with trauma. Maybe there's a lot of emotion that's here. So that's the idea. If we meditate, we'll eventually encounter our trauma. It's a very powerful practice. Now, that's not automatically a bad thing. We want people to be working with their trauma. The question here is, do they have a shield? Do you have different tools and shields that you can work with inside your practice? Now, the fact that you're with Angie and you're in with the Brahm Center, my sense is you will already have many different options and shields to work with because Angie's informed around trauma. Other traditions, you know, people that they don't really work with shields. So that's a big part of what we've been doing these last couple of days is really offering you different tools or shields. So here's a few examples of shields that you now have based on the sessions we've done. So yesterday we talked about hitting the brakes. So that might be opening your eyes inside of practice or taking breaks. We worked with different anchors of attention. So you don't always just have to focus on the breath. We can work with sensations, other places of the body or sound. And then we did a couple of other tools. We did the practice around synchronizing our hands with the breath. And we did the practice of containment where we had our hands here or making physical contact. So there's many different shields that you can work with. And the part of the path over time is learning for yourself what you need in a given moment. All of us will be different. I know for me, sometimes doing shorter practices is very helpful. Sometimes having my eyes open and looking out to what's in front of me, that's very helpful. But for other people, it's different. So you finding what works for you um, is really the path. And what's amazing is you've spent now 4 days on retreat, and that is a gift that many people either can't access or they choose not to. So, just want to say, good job of staying in, being on this retreat because it's like a boot camp. You're like building your muscle. You're really strengthening your practice. And then coming out of the retreat, it will be very positive, or it can be very positive. So today we're going to work with a couple of different more shields, and the we're going to work with cultivating safety in practice, and then we'll do some work around self-compassion, because self-compassion has actually been shown to be very regulating for our window of tolerance. So we'll do a little bit of work around that. I'm just going to pause for a moment, see if there's any comments or questions. Angie, if you want to add anything here, but just want to make sure, just see if that's clear around the shields and Medusa before we move on. Okay, great. Well, there'll be more time for questions later too. So let's see. Let's actually start with self compassion. I think that's a nice place to start. So I'll come back to the slides. Let me just for a few minutes give a couple of some evidence as to why self compassion. Because sometimes people they hear self compassion and they think, oh, this is just about trying to feel nice, and but there's actually a lot of great research about self compassion, mindfulness, and trauma. So I'll share a couple of things here. Okay. So compassion, Angie might have done already some work here with compassion, but let me just a couple definitions just to refresh us. So compassion is sometimes referred to as a strong feeling of empathy for the suffering or bad luck of others, and a wish to help them. Um, One of the differences between compassion and loving kindness is that loving kindness is usually very general, that we can be loving and kind to ourselves and to others regardless of what's happening. Compassion is evoked when someone like ourselves or others is encountering suffering. It's a response to suffering. So when we're working with compassion, this is one reason it's so important with trauma, is that compassion is this response to bad luck, to suffering of others, and wanting to help someone. That natural feeling of wanting to support. A definition here also is to suffer with. That if one of you, even yesterday when some of you were sharing about your pain, I could feel my heart just going, oh, I'm with you. And Angie, when you were holding the hand yesterday, I'm sorry, I forget the name of that person. That was very much compassion. We're being with someone. So self compassion is a practice where we are taking our natural uh, response of compassion and we are turning this back towards ourselves in a very purposeful way with practice. So, this idea that we're directing care and compassion back towards us. Kristen Neff, some of you might know, she's a very popular researcher around self compassion. She said, self compassion is giving ourselves the same kindness and care that we would give to a good friend. So that's self compassion. I think of it like a kind of a rainbow that is coming from us, and we turn it around. We turn it around and we beam it back towards ourselves. So let me just offer a very brief definition here. Uh, Kristen Neff talks about three parts of self compassion. One is self kindness, that in a moment of suffering, both here on retreat or in our lives outside in the world, we are being kind to ourselves, that's an element of self compassion. The second part of self compassion is that we do not feel, or we feel a common humanity, meaning we feel connected to other people who might be going through a similar form of suffering or who are suffering more generally. So I mentioned this story about my friend. I think I mentioned it. My friend, he fell here, he hurt his arm, and he was having a hard time. He's being very hard on himself. He was saying, oh, why did I not turn on the light? I slipped. And at some point, he started to be more compassionate to himself and just being kind and saying, it's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. And it's okay. You were moving fast. You were hungry. And then at some point, he also said, there's a lot of people who are in pain right now, that I alone am not the one who broke my arm. there are other people who are experiencing this right now. We actually went to the hospital, and there was, many people there who had been also hurt in different ways. So self-compassion is also connecting to the suffering of others and the fact that we are not alone. Yeah, often, I'm sure Angie's talked about this, our pain is from the feeling of isolation, that no one understands what we're going through or that we're alone in our suffering. So self-compassion also involves connecting with the fact other people, they suffer as well. And then the final element of self-compassion is also mindfulness. It's very difficult to be kind and compassionate to ourselves if we're not mindful. If we don't notice that we are, um, being self-critical, or if we are suffering and in pain, then in all likelihood, we'll just continue on with our unconscious behavior. But if we are mindful, if we can notice what's happening in the present moment, become awake, it's more likely that we would be able to be self-compassionate. So this is a three-part definition of self-compassion: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. Let me say one more thing here about why this relates to trauma, and then we'll move into a practice here. So why self-compassion for us here around trauma? So there's two reasons. The first is that mindful self-compassion will support our window of tolerance. So remember the window that we talked about yesterday in between hyper and hypoarousal? There's a lot of research that suggests that self-compassion helps with regulation. So some of you might have heard this term, heart rate variability. This basically means that what is the rhythm of our heartbeat? When we are very, very stressed out, our heart rate variability is low. Our heart rate is very like always on the same beat. And when we're relaxed, when we are in our window, our heart rate variability is actually quite high, which is a little counterintuitive, but it basically means that there's some flexibility in our nervous system. Yeah, so if we're stressed, the heart is beating dong, 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 dong. If we are more relaxed, then our heart can go gong, 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 gong. It can be in different beats. And that means that our system is more resilient and more flexible. So here's a paper. I can send any of these papers if you like. That people who are practicing self-compassion, that they have increased heart rate variability, that their bodies and minds are actually more flexible. Second is that there is a support of physiological arousal, which is what is being measured in the window of tolerance. So people who practice self-compassion have been shown to have lower levels of hyperarousal and also increased parasympathetic activation, meaning that if someone is more in hyperarousal, they're more likely to be able to come into their window if they're practicing self-compassion. So that's just a couple reasons why self-compassion supports regulation and our window of tolerance. And then second is the fact that self-compassion helps with shame. I'll just say something very briefly. So shame is talked about as a painful feeling of humiliation or distress that's caused by the consciousness or awareness of wrong or foolish behavior. So, this is when we feel very bad about ourselves. Here's another definition: a self punishing acknowledgement of something gone wrong. So, you could think for yourself here of the last time that you felt shame, some embarrassment, this feeling of humiliation that we've done something wrong. Uh, a teacher of mine said, shame is the difference between shame and guilt is that guilt is when we feel like we did something wrong. Shame is when we feel like we are wrong, that we did something bad. We feel dirty, we feel embarrassed. It's a very difficult emotion to work with. And I bring it up here because people who live through trauma, they will tend to experience elevated levels of shame. Yeah, if we've lived through trauma, we tend to feel more shame. And inside of that, there's some research that tells us that self compassion helps us to work well with shame. So if we're feeling bad and embarrassed and being hard on ourselves, self compassion can help us. It can actually help us not be so hard on ourselves, not beat ourselves up along the way. So I'm going to pause here to see if there's any comments. Angie, if you want to add anything. And then if there's any comments or questions, and then we're going to move into some practices around self-compassion. And then we'll probably take a break before we come back. But Angie, anything you want to add here? Or is there any comments or questions about any aspect of self-compassion, shame, and regulation?
Thank you, David. I would just add that when we have more self-compassion, we also build up our self-confidence. Because a lot of times when we're not comfortable with ourselves because we have such a critical mind of why we're not good enough. And that whole discomfort of just being me comes from the narrative that's going on in the mind. So when we have self-compassion is to know that, yeah, I'm imperfect, just like everyone else. That is common humanity. We have something in common that we're all good in different things and we all make mistakes. And there are times that we have setbacks in life. And there are things that we got tempted to do, which we otherwise wouldn't. And because we were in that moment of weakness. And to be able to accept that we all have moments of weakness, that self-compassion helps us to recover and to regain that self-composure and being comfortable with ourselves, to rebuild our self-confidence. Thank you, David.
That's beautiful, Angie. Thank you. I love how you talked about that. I sometimes wish there was just a pill that we could take that would have us feel more self-compassionate. It's a hard practice, and it's a challenging one. So yeah, thank you, Angie. It's beautiful.